Good morning, and welcome to the Society for Academic Emergency Medicine SAEM20 virtual meeting. I am Dr. Jim Holmes, SAEM President. SAEM is the premier international organization representing researchers and educators in emergency medicine. In our work, SAEM promotes and facilitates scientific discovery, educational innovation, and the professional and leadership development of our members. Today, we are proud to bring you a medical education keynote entitled Efficiencies in Education, How to Hack Educational Training to Get from 10,000 Hours to 100 Hours. During this presentation and during our questions and answers session, you will hear from Dr. Jonathan Sherbino. Dr. Sherbino is the Assistant Dean of Health Professions Education Research and Faculty of Health Sciences at McMaster University in Ontario, Canada. He is also a Professor of Medicine at McMaster University. Dr. Sherbino is the past chair of the Specialty Committee for Emergency Medicine, Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons of Canada. He is a clinical educator, co-editor of the CanMed's 2015 framework, and co-host of the Key Literature in Medical Education podcast. He has published over 135 papers and 5 books. Jonathan is an award-winning teacher whose accolades include the National 2018 Canadian Emergency Medicine Teacher of the Year. His research focuses on competency-based medical education. He will be sharing evidence-informed techniques to improve learning efficiency with your institution. During the presentation, you may submit questions for Dr. Sherbino by clicking the Q&A button in your Zoom menu interface. Questions that are upvoted will be prioritized during our questions and answer session to start immediately after his presentation has concluded. I would now like to introduce Dr. Jonathan Sherbino. Welcome to you, and thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Jim, for that very kind introduction. Probably the most important thing for our audience to know is that I'm also a full-time clinician. And so in that, I am an active faculty member in our residency training programs, and I'm thinking about how do I maintain my own competence? How do I acquire new knowledge many years post-graduation? And so I hope that this conversation that we have today is not one that is abstract or based from an ivory tower, but in fact is very practical and implementable today and in your future practice and in your roles in different education training programs. I'd also like to extend a thanks to the Society for Academic Emergency Medicine and the leadership there for giving me this opportunity to share my perspectives on important education theory that we can make practical and implementable. Next slide, please. Certainly in the course of our hour together, the ability to drill down into some of these complex ideas will be limited. And so I'm giving you more of an overview, recognizing that some of you will be more interested in understanding further theory or getting more of a background explanation. This URL or this QR code will provide you a number of resources from the empirical evidence of experimental trials to narrative or systematic reviews. There's podcasts, there's infographics, whatever will be helpful for you and for your practice. Next slide. And before we begin, just a comment on disclosure. I have nothing to disclose. I have no conflicts of interest. Certainly my spouse is wondering why I chose to be an education scientist, because we don't get to rub shoulders with industry in any particular way. Next slide. My title of this presentation does involve a bit of clickbait. The idea of 10,000 hours is one that's in the common literature and in the popular media. And there's an assumption, I think, that we imagine that expertise comes with prolonged dwell times. And if you think back to your own residency training, or if you're a resident today and you're looking forward to the interminable hours of rotations and shifts, it does feel like the magic in education is just be there for a long time. But in fact, this 10,000 hour rule, popularized by Malcolm Gladwell in his New York Times bestseller, Outliers, originally stems from the work of Anders Ericsson. And this is a portion of Anders' work here, and it suggests that this 10,000 hours, in fact, is a misnomer. The black bars represent chess masters, the elite of the elite. And the distribution, although non-parametric, certainly shows that a number of chess masters achieved excellence and supremacy over this content area in under 2,000 hours. Others took more than 22,000 hours. And so we see a range in a distribution. There's not a cut, fast, milestone that 10,000 hours suddenly makes you an expert in any domain. And so while there certainly is individual characteristics that are unique and our genetics probably play a role, I would like to suggest to all of us that there's elements in how we deliver education and how we optimize the environment for learning that can allow us to not simply say, I have to be here for 10,000 hours to simply acquire expertise. There's moments for efficiency and effectiveness, and we should be attuned to those moments. Next slide. I want to share with you 5 key principles, and they're not processes, and I make this distinction this way. I'm not going to tell you what to do, but I am going to show you key ideas from the literature that are informed by theory and suggest to you that if you can think about the uniqueness of your own context, the needs that you have, how you can influence your training programs, then you can figure out how to make these work. You can figure out the process. You can figure out how to operationalize them. And so let's start with these idea of the 5 key principles. Next slide. AI seems to be all the rage in everything you read, and there seems to be an assumption that the way a computer works is analogous to how the brain works. And although there are features that are common, it's not a perfect one-to-one analogy. We might like to imagine that I can simply click and drag or cut and paste, and as a teacher, I can upload into the mind of my student all that I want to share with them. Here is the 10 things you must do in managing hyperkalemia. Wait for the upload, and when that's complete, that student suddenly has acquired that knowledge. And in fact, nothing could be further from the truth. Next slide. This is a cognitivist model. It's called the Modal Model of memory. It has been critiqued for being perhaps simplistic, and we won't get into all the details here. But this model, based on the empiric evidence that we have, suggests that the vast majority of stimulus that we encounter in every moment and in every day, we lose track of, we ignore, we pay no attention to. For that, a small amount of stimulus that makes its way into our working memory, we attend to it and we code it into our long-term memory. And so in the absence of alcoholism or stroke or traumatic brain injury, we have an infinite capacity for storage. But what is important for us to understand is that the way we code it is unique to us. It's not a perfect mirroring. It's not an exact replication. And in fact, we are informed by our previous experience, by what we know, and by what we prioritize and what we pay attention to and what we emphasize. And so you give me, here's the 10 things you must remember in the management of hyperkalemia. And how I create that node in my long-term memory is not an exact replication. Now, certainly there's not a lot of variation you can have in how you might manage hyperkalemia. And so when we look at how you represent it, there could be a significant degree of overlap. But when we get into more complex, more nuanced, more messy problems about how we might manage a problem in emergency medicine, that overlap starts to space. So what does this mean for us? When we encounter material, we do not simply upload it into our mind as a direct representation. When we teach and when we engage our learners, the same phenomenon doesn't happen. Next slide. The key idea is that we do not simply transfer information, we construct it in a personalized and an idiosyncratic way for each of us. Constructivism, an inductive theory, would offer a compelling supporting argument that says we don't have any one perfect view of reality, but we encounter reality, we try to make meaning of it, and in that sense meaning, we test and generate hypotheses, and we create a representation in the way that we think best represents that external world. And so it's important for us to understand there's not one copy of how to do everything, but rather multiple ways of understanding, making sense, and representing information. How that impacts your learning and how that impacts how you function as a teacher, you need to understand what will be the changes in the processes that you want to make. Next slide. This is a trauma suite where I practice. I'm also a trauma physician. This is after caring for one of my patients. This is a wicked problem. Kind problems are one where there's a very short and linear connection from A to B, where the feedback is automated, where the guardrails are very tight, and where it becomes very clear that if you don't choose option A, it doesn't lead to option B. And the system is well imbued to make that apparent and clear. That is not emergency medicine. Emergency medicine is not kind, and in fact, it is wicked. And so too often and too frequently we assume that simply by having your 10,000 hours of exposure where we dump you into these complex and chaotic messes, that somehow over time you will acquire experience. The further can be from the truth. Next slide. In fact, what we need is a process of specific and immediate feedback for these complex and wicked environments. When we look at how we might want to integrate the management of the polytraumatized patient, the process would not be to simply let our learners into that environment and provide no feedback. The assumptions on their decision and the outcomes of those would not typically be provided to them. And so they can continue forward in a trial and error process that never actually shows them what the error looks like. Some of us suggest that the process is one of ATLS. And I'm not here to deconstruct the challenges of ATLS. Certainly, for the novice, how we can give a structure is very appropriate. But you as an expert practicing and managing the resuscitation of this polytraumatized patient, do not use an algorithm. Certainly the work of Gary Klein and his recognition prime decision-making, which would suggest that whether you're a fire captain or a physician, the use of an algorithm is not part of the decision-making and processing that you use in these complex environments. So what do we need? We need a process to get them from ATLS to the expertise that is unconscious in our practice. That first one is deliberate practice. What Anders Ericsson would say is the hallmark of acquiring expertise. Performance with immediate, specific feedback on things to change, to maintain, or to add. So let's be thoughtful how we are as a teacher. But an improved model of that is one of mastery learning. When you take the complex task of managing a polytraumatized patient and breaking it down into the sub-units that are all collectively informing that bigger task. And so you allow the learner to work on that fundamental skill set, continually working on it to acquire mastery there before the next intermediate layer is added upon and suddenly the task becomes more complex. In doing so, we make the bite that a learner needs to take much more manageable. They have an opportunity to kind of continually wrestle with the fundamental pieces before they need to add a layer of complexity, before they add the final and master layer. This is the magic of simulation. We can deconstruct really complex tasks in their constituent parts, allow regular practice in a safe fashion to acquire ability, and then layer on complexity so that the jump is one that is manageable rather than one that is impossible. Emergency medicine is a wicked environment. Simply being present without feedback will ensure that it takes far more than 10,000 hours to ever acquire expertise. Next task. I appreciate the irony of what I'm going to say next, but too frequently our educational interventions are one that is just in time, a single intervention. We say, okay, somewhere in our curriculum, we need our trainees to be able to break bad news. So I'm going to schedule 90 minutes into this session, sign off on the curriculum blueprint, and there you have it. Or likewise, I'm going to prepare for this re-credentialing exam by cramming in the final days and hours before the exam to get something there that's loosely understood or held so that perhaps I can have a little bit of recognition when it's time to engage in that material. I get it. Here I am doing rounds as a single intervention. Hopefully you'll engage with some of the other materials so that you can benefit from a process that looks at the value of spaced repetition. Next slide. 19th century physiologist Ebbinghaus demonstrated that our inability to access material was a function of time. Now, I've already suggested to you that our long-term memory, unless we injure it somehow, has an infinite capacity and we don't necessarily forget. What we are challenged to do is bring that node of information from our long-term memory into our working memory so that we can engage, turn with it, and apply it to the challenge and task at hand. The way that we do that is we build multiple synapses and build a network to access that node. That we ideally encounter it in multiple formats so that we can see the problem from a number of different angles. The actual patient presentation, the expert explanation via lecture, study materials, the podcast, all of which are articulating different elements from different perspectives of an idea, spacing over time with the interval increasing with time, so that when we go to access that information at the bedside in the care of our patients, we don't have a single synapse into that node where we struggle to find the way in, but we have multiple paths and a network to access that information to recall it quickly. Next slide. In fact, what we would love to do if we could be very efficient and hack our training programs is structure a spiral model of curriculum, where our first pass of the information looks at it in fairly wide, broad bite, but not with any significant depth, more of a superficial, returning to it again to add complexity, and then finally again for a much deeper and much more nuanced and rich version. The instruction I give to the incoming residents is to get the thinnest, smallest study guide of emergency medicine and pay attention only to the cardinal presentations. That's not to say mass casualty or environmental emergencies are not worthy, but on that first pass, I want to not overwhelm the ability to work on other processes and get a fundamental understanding of the diagnostic and management criteria for common presentations. When you return to it in the second pass in the subsequent year, then we start adding on the mimics, then we start adding on physiology. And then in Canada, because I guess it's cold here all the time and our brains don't work as quick, it takes up to 5 years for our specialist emergency physicians to graduate. So in those multiple spirals down, each time returning to information in a spaced process, we add increasing complexity so that at the end of this training process, we truly have a rich, broad, and deep understanding of how the key and cardinal information relevant to emergency medicine is established. Next slide. To sustain learning, a single vaccination is inefficient. We need re-inoculation. So what have we heard so far? We don't simply upload information, we actually construct meaning. We encounter, attend to, and make connections with what we already know. Emergency medicine is a wicked problem, and so, or the environment of emergency medicine is a wicked problem. And so we require immediate feedback, ideally sequenced in such a way so that that feedback is progressive from the very novice to the intermediate to the expert. And then if you believe that a single intervention, reading a single paper, going to a single lecture, irony, focusing on a topic in a single setting will ensure that you have a robust recall of that information down the line, you may be impaired. We need re-inoculation. The concepts of spaced repetition and spiral curriculum. How are you implementing processes for your own learning and for your engagement with your training programs? Next slide. One of the things that probably was the hallmark of my own training in education, and perhaps a function of the fact that as physicians, we are some element almost professional learners. We've been in primary and secondary and undergraduate and medical school and residency training, and for some of us graduate school, and we have acquired patterns that mimic what we've always done. Now, the evolutionary pressure has ensured that some of those practices actually are best practice. We may not know which ones are those. Other practices are simply the things that we do because we've always done that. And if there's one thing that I would encourage you to recall from this, is that if you have a practice of learning that involves a highlighter, then throw it out. If you were to look at my study notes from residency, you would see textbooks that were just rainbow, elegantly colored, showing a dedication that I returned to the same page time and time again with a new color and a new code and a new schema. And if you didn't suffer a seizure looking at those textbooks, then good for you. Next slide. But it's very clear in experimental evidence that simply reading and rereading and simply sitting there by force of will saying, I will upload this information is an inefficient and ineffective method. And so if that is your process, throw out that highlighter and attend to these principles that will help you. This is an example of elaboration. This individual has constructed, and they've used some kind of design feature. You can imagine simply developing your own version of notes. You can imagine your own schemata. They have taken a content area, acquired new information from the lecture, from conference, from academic half day, from the podcast, from their reading, from the primary literature, from the review literature, and have built a representation that makes sense to them. At no point is there any highlighter here. They presumably have engaged with other material that they already know and have integrated that new information with old and have a revised elaborative schema. But even more powerful than elaboration is recall. Next slide. Now, I don't necessarily advocate for these archaic forms of actual physical paper flashcards, although this is a site where I'm a part of the editorial board for Canadian EM, which is a large educational free open access resource that if you haven't produced any flashcards in your own training, they're produced for you. Next slide. And certainly the digital world has thousands of variations or iterations of this. But the process of recall, not specifically flashcards, but the process of recall is even more powerful for learning than the process of elaboration in head-to-head studies. What happens there? It is forcing your working memory to access long-term memory and find the synapse, make its way through the network to find the node of information required. And it's effortful. As we practice routinely over and over, that work will increase the ability to access network and to find the appropriate synapse into that node and allows it to be brought into the working memory. Elaboration expands and increases the network so you have multiple roads to access that node. And simply reading and rereading with a highlighter just makes that one little highway more and more dense, but not as accessible with multiple different ways to get to the same destination. Next slide. And so if we want to be efficient and effective, then recall, mixed recall, effortful mixed recall may be our best option. So let me talk very briefly about this idea of desirable difficulty. I speak to my children frequently saying that when it hurts when you're doing your schoolwork, that's probably a nice little surrogate that you're being really profound in your learning. When it's easy, you're probably simply reinforcing knowledge and reinforcing skills and abilities that you already have acquired. Effort is one of those markers of engaging and really starting to learn, with the caveat that it needs to be desirable, that there is some point where your sympathetic system will turn on and you will not be able to respond. The bite is too big, the challenge is too large. And this idea of mixed, and so the fancy word for mixed is interleaving. If you choose only to work on areas in one domain, I'm only going to address toxicology, then you build a network that's just really a sub-network. But if you interleave toxicology, pediatrics, and cardiology, then you have a much richer network that's more representative of the authentic environment in which you're going to access this information. Next slide. So where have we come so far? We do not upload information, we construct it. We don't simply drag and drop. We require progressive sequenced feedback to ensure that the assumptions about how we are making decisions are actually leading to outcomes that are true, so that we can refine, direct course. And if we can sequence it, then the challenge of taking on a really daring or an audacious skill or ability or competence can be sequenced down into much more manageable pieces. We need a process that ensures that it's not a simple one-time intervention. And if we are believing that a single intervention will ensure stable, long-term retention, then we're really probably fooling ourselves. We need to think about how we are spacing our learning. And then if we can use processes like elaboration and ideally like recall that are in a mixed practice, then we can be most efficient. And so the final idea around principles that I would encourage you to think about your own learning or how you might contribute to the educational systems you're a part of reflects a change in how we are structuring education. The current process for medical school and residency and certification and recertification really looks as the unit of analysis as the individual. And so we study on our own, we learn on our own, we write exams on our own, we demonstrate competence individually, and yet we turn to work and we practice in teams. We're social. Next slide. And as Bandura would assert, it's very clear that our social influences are profound in how we learn. Think of an opinion leader in your group who has influenced how you might want to learn or acquire new skills and abilities. I think of my own practice. I graduated before point of care ultrasound was a feature of training. And then as I saw members of my own business group using and routinely improving the quality of care in our department, this became something that I decided I need to acquire. And it was because I had a desire to imitate that I pursued this. Think of your role as a teacher. Most of the learning that your students acquire from you has very little to do with what you say, and more based on the modeling that your students have of how you act. What is the role of shared values and of pace settings? If you want to maintain your diet, simply put a wager with a friend who gets to collect on that money, and that psychological pressure will keep you much more in line with your plans for exercise and eat rightly, which I guess with all of us in a COVID lockup, we could all pay a little attention to. But equally, that same psychological pressure that comes from us as working as social beings within a group can be drivers to ensure that we are attentive to our own learning and no longer looking and reflecting at ourselves as simply the unit of learning as the individual, but being more attentive to the process of how we work and function as a group. Next slide. So I've talked about 5 principles. Before we go to Q&A, I'm going to just talk about 3 myths which really get under my skin and I want to debunk in some way. And I've been thinking about how we can play this game at home. You can't vote, and so I'm going to ask you to keep score for yourself. And if you tell yourself, put out 1 finger that's a true, be selective in which that 1 finger is going to be, and 2 fingers will be false. I'm going to say a statement, and then I'd like you to vote at home. Play along. Next slide. Learning styles are an important element that must be considered so that when you have students who are visual learners, they must be equally attended to students who are oral learners. So true or false? 1 finger for true, 2 fingers for false. Vote. This is definitely false. And I'm not sure if you played along, but I'll pretend because I can't really see you. The wealth of data is clear that learning styles are not a phenomenon. And so if you have students coming to you say, sorry, I need a partial task trainer in order to understand that, or I need you to create a whole podcast because I don't work well with the slide deck that you've shared. I think the simple answer is that's not something that needs to be accommodated. But neither should you use that as a reason to resist learning formats. And you should be cautious about the assumptions and the barriers you put before yourself unintentionally. Now, that's not to say that we don't align the instructional method with the goals of the learning. It'd be really ridiculous for me to write a textbook chapter on how to perform a technical skill. I should probably demonstrate that using a physical model, a phantom of some type. Equally, it would be ridiculous for individuals to simulate out developing a differential diagnosis for chest pain. It's resource intensive with little utility. So we want to not necessarily ascribe to this myth of learning styles, but at the same time be attuned, is the learning required in the best modality? All right, myth number 2. Next up. We're emergency physicians, so we want to believe this to be the case. You can effectively multitask as an expert, performing several tasks simultaneously. 1 is true, 2 is false. Vote. Let's see if you cheated yourself. The pattern here is becoming clear. This is definitely a myth. As much as we'd like to imagine that we can multitask, and as much as we know that we are interrupted, Carrie Chisholm's work on interruption is really profound suggesting that we're interrupted every 8 minutes with a critical task. What in fact we cannot do is think in a very high intense or very conscious way about 2 tasks simultaneously. In fact, we do rapid task switching. We automate task 1 so that we can turn our conscious attention to task 2. Now, this becomes okay as we start to achieve mastery. We can pause and interpret an EKG while performing suturing of a patient because we can automate those technical skills once we've achieved mastery of that procedure. You should never ask the medical student to do that. Suddenly the fingers will be sewn together. But this assumption that we can multitask and that this is a function of our environment is a false recognition of how our brain works. And in multitasking, the big challenge is that we have degradation of information. When we automate task 1 to attend to task 2, we lose small amounts of the fidelity of that information presented to us as we transition from an automated to an attentive task. And so as much as we'd like to be able to provide pain and nausea orders for a patient, a nurse is talking to us while we're trying to manage a seizure in somebody who needs to be actively resuscitated, both patients are going to get less optimal care. The final myth, slide. And this is one that really strikes home. It's the idea that we can self-assess. It's the basis of our CME, our continuing professional development. So one, yes, we are effective self-assessors. We can be self-directed learners and set out our own learning goals. 2, we are ineffective. So vote. And so here we are at a hat trick. We are ineffective at self-assessment. We can't see what we don't know. It's hard to see your own lacune. The Dunning-Kruger effect would say that people who are high performers have the lowest assessment of their ability because they have a great perspective of the scope of the problem before them. Whereas novices have a high appreciation of their own ability because they are so new to the domain, they have no idea of the scope. So what does this mean for us as we continue to develop our own learning programs, as we try to maintain competence years and decades from training, as we want to ensure that we're providing the best care for our patients? It's not to fall into that fallacy of saying, I know exactly what I need, but it's to have others provide a peer consult to say, here's an area to be suggestive of. It's to get supporting or refuting data from your practice. And I don't mean the type of data that says 72 hours after you disposed someone from the emergency department, they got readmitted. That type of crude data is not helpful. But it is essential that we don't believe the fallacy of self-assessment. For myself, I stopped caring for children and moved to an adult-only emergency department for the most part about 7 years ago. When I left training, I thought I had competence to manage the pediatric patient who required resuscitation. Catch me on the wrong day, I probably would still believe that same assumption. I don't think I've changed. And yet what has happened? Over the last 7 years, I've had a dramatic reduction in the patients who are children requiring resuscitation. And as such, there's been a degradation of my skill. My own self-assessment would be impaired, but data from my practice or near peer support would suggest, hey, this might be an area that you should prioritize in your ongoing CME. Next slide. So I'm going to turn to Jim, and he's going to facilitate some conversations before we move to the final portion with some final thoughts.
Thank you, Dr. Sherbino. Let's take a few questions from the audience. In a few moments, we will answer questions from the audience. As a reminder for those who are attending the live session, please send your questions in via the Q&A pop-up window by clicking the Q&A button in your Zoom menu interface. We will try to get to as many questions as possible in our remaining time. So while the questions are coming in, I would like to ask Dr. Sherbino, what is the role for digital learning in the next generation medical education curricula?
So I think it's a pertinent question. In this era, we're seeing a massive transition of in-person learning being loaded online. I think there are some features that make online platforms really helpful. It speaks to scale. so we can reach and access a large population with very limited additional resources after the purchase of a platform or the use of a free platform. It allows asynchronicity, and so we don't require everyone to learn in step. It allows review so that you can access or reattend to the information regularly on a tailored self-prescribed rate. And it also flattens a bit of the hierarchy of who is an expert teacher. And we've seen that as part of the free open access medical education movement, as people who were traditionally in universities or were identified as professors of emergency medicine or great teachers, they have been met alongside with other people who have a great wealth of experience, and now they have a channel and voice. But a caution. A platform is only a platform. If you developed online learning that did not think about the 5 principles that we've talked about, then you have a really lousy online process. Some people may be concerned about the utility, and so there's a great meta-analysis in JAMA. It's old, and here I'm going to do a shameless plug for my podcast, the Key Literature and Medical Education podcast, Keyline. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts. We recently did a review of this paper, and it essentially shows that compared to no other resource, online resources are really effective at teaching. And head-to-head with a traditional in-person, so an online resource versus a seminar or an in-person lecture, they have equivalence. And so nothing necessarily is lost. With the take-home caveat, if you don't have a principled approach to how you design your educational intervention, the internets are simply a platform and everything will fail.
Thank you very much. A question from Michael Brown. Does Bandura's social learning theory explain why the massive online open course, i.e. Coursera, excitement has now died down?
So what I think what you see with MOOCs is an attrition rate of around 95 to 97%. And what I think it happens is twofold. You feel disconnected and you may not have the same level of engagement. And second, you don't have that pace setting phenomenon of working with a cohort and moving through. I've been involved with a number of very successful online faculty development initiatives with a shout out to Academic Life and Emergency Medicine. And the secret there was not that we were online and we're effective. And certainly we spanned junior faculty and early career faculty from Canada, US, and South America. So we had a large, diverse geographical set allowed by the platform. But the success of that program was that people worked in a cohort and engaged using the digital media rather than simply being isolated and anonymous looking at a screen. So I think, Mike, what you're suggesting is if you simply have a platform that does not allow people to engage and the social phenomenon is so powerful and so strong, then attrition is really high.
Thank you, very interesting. A question from Daniel Martin. Our ACGME requires that we have a certain number of residents present for our lectures to count for didactics. But since learners are always in different phases of knowledge, inoculation, and vaccination, then should most of our didactics be year-specific didactics for PGY1s, PGY2s, PGY3s, etc.?
I think it's Daniel. So thanks, Daniel, for that question. I'd turn you to the team-based learning literature that's structured in an interesting phenomenon where you can sequence senior, intermediate, and junior learners within a team. And the process by which you engage in the material looks something very similar to the spiral models I've suggested, that you don't need to pull people apart to be effective, but in fact, you can have different tasks assigned to different levels of experience that allow individuals to participate more collectively as a group. And I think that's much more of a naturalistic social phenomenon. And be cautious too of assigning competence simply by postgraduate year. In Canada, we've made a transition to a competency-based model 2 years ago in emergency medicine. And while your pay still stays the same based on what calendar year you are in, you have the ability to advance forward or to have a delayed advancement in terms of the educational or expertise. And so whether you are junior, intermediate, or advanced. The calendar is not a good predictor about who is at the right level, and so be cautious of simply assigning expertise based on the PGY level, although it's a crude surrogate that works. Having said all that, I think models where we incorporate individuals together allow a senior to take perhaps an educational role or an explanatory role, where juniors get to be pace set by intermediates. That can be very powerful. And so no, I would not add to your complexity of conference by having multiple streams depending on which PGY level you have.
Very interesting. A question from Sarah Kleinschmidt. Any tips on how to implement these concepts you have discussed within current educational structures, like our isolated weekly conferences?
Thanks for the question, Sarah. It's a big piece. It would all depend on which tip and in which context. I'd turn your attention to the resources, and maybe if we can pull up the next slide, people can access that while we're talking. It will provide a number of different resources and a number of different examples, and then the reference list from this will allow you to go down whatever kind of rabbit hole that you're pursuing. I think we can be very effective at delivering education in this very unusual and novel time. I'm going to share an example from our own residency program. We have a very active simulation program. And so in the absence of being able to perform simulations in person, we are using some of the in situ simulations that we've conducted in our hospital in preparing and managing the treatment of COVID patients, and then have run simulations and debriefs in a virtual environment, being thoughtful about what's the process of debriefing informed by the debriefing literature, being thoughtful for the processes around the idea of practice and repetition essential for simulation, and thinking through these processes, but simply using a new platform to make sure it works. And it's been fairly successful, and we've published on that, so you can see some of that work coming up from McMaster.
Very interesting. We have a question from Joseph Reardon. Do you have a similar trend in Canada of mid-level providers developing special tracks? If so, how do we maintain the learning environment of our residency programs when we have multiple learners of quite different backgrounds in the learning space?
Thanks for your question, Joseph. We don't have the same proportional representation of mid-level providers in Canada, although we're seeing a trend that's showing it's a fairly steep curve as they start to come online. I would speak more broadly about the processes by which we see increasing specialization and subdivision in emergency medicine in particular, and in the House of Medicine in general. We should attend to the need to recognize sub and subspecialization, which I think is part of the question you're asking. Because that, if we don't attend to it, it's simply the process of sticking your head in the sand and saying science will not advance, and the task of gaining mastery of that area is not relevant. And I think that's a flaw for the delivery of best quality care for our patients. But at the same time, we should not take that as a way to denigrate the extreme value of generalists. In emergency medicine in particular, I think we have a really interesting role to serve in educational and administrative and in clinical practice within medicine in general, because as generalists, we understand the integration of all of the different specialties and subspecialties and subspecialties within medicine. We see that intersection. And so your question about how do we challenge streams that would look to only providing training in a very narrow area and having multiple streams at intersection or at heads with a more generalist approach. I think the process is to ground as the organizing feature generalist training to ensure that the breadth of emergency medicine is captured, and for mid-levels who are participating in emergency medicine practice to have contact there. To allow moments within some organized curricula for people to follow specific streams and gain experience, but always with the goal of linking it back to how does it integrate more broadly. There's nothing I find more frustrating when I consult an ophthalmologist for a retinal detachment only to be told they're an oculoplastic physician and they don't really know what to do. It's important in my practice to have an understanding of how this is going to be managed in the time frame for such. But it's also important for patient care that we have an integration. And so I would suggest that an education system should ground it in the general process, and we should continue to endorse and support generalism, which I think is a key element in the delivery of medicine. We should allow moments for people to achieve subspecialization, but not in absence and not in allowing them not to attend to their commitment to the generalist practice that is their starting point.
Thank you very much. We have a question from Stephen Polvoy. What do you see as the future of CME, given the principles you have described in this presentation?
I'm going to turn to the work of Lara Cook, who's at the University of Calgary. And so I'm going to reference her because I'm going to steal her big idea. She's written about this in the Implementation Science Journal. The current model in Canada is I am maintaining my certification if I subscribe to a bunch of journals and I go to a bunch of conferences. And most of those journals, well, they're not print anymore, but they sit somewhere on my iPad, sometimes read, most often not. And at most conferences, I'm more interested in seeing my friends and maybe on occasion presenting one of my posters. I think that model is really flawed, and as much work as we've seen done at the graduate medical education, the next big challenge for us as educators is to tackle continuing professional development. What Lara would suggest is that if we situate our continuing professional education in a socialized group form, we can see better outcomes. And so she's done this experimentally with a collection of physicians, in this case, neurologists, who received very discrete data points about their common practice in a single city, addressing a topic that they all thought was important. So they identified the topic. The EMR provided very specific, detailed patient outcomes that were provided to each individual to show how care was being provided. And she almost describes a Kubler-Ross type of phenomenon where at first there was anger and denial, and then sadness, and eventually reconciliation, as people made various excuses as to why that data didn't really reflect their true practice. And when in fact, the homogeny across academic neurologists in a single center, they're pretty common. But then collectively, armed with that individual knowledge, they then were able to work out, here is the solution to the gap that we've identified. We have a problem, we understand our data as to where we are, and now let's collectively work on that. In the pace setting, the inter-accountability ensured that that group of neurologists were able to tack off a real world problem that would have real world implications to their patients, and then develop it in a way that was not ad hoc, but that actually led to a step forward in that entire community. I think that's really interesting. It requires feedback, it demonstrates social accountability, and it leads to the identification of a problem that people don't just imagine, but is informed by the data there.
That's very interesting. We have a question from Dr. David Sklar. Many academic physicians, either as clinician scientists or administrators, begin to spend less time clinically, and their expertise potentially deteriorates. Yet it is important that they maintain clinical involvement. How do we suggest that they address the inevitable loss of clinical expertise through continued learning?
Thanks, David, for your question, and I hope that you're enjoying your time post-academic medicine. So it gets back to the idea of expertise, if unaccessed, will show decay. Now, where that shows decay will be probably individualized to the practitioner, and also must be balanced with changes in implementation of new sciences and new approach. And so there's a fundamental element of decay, and there's also an element of non-acquisition of new information. I think the process is, one, attention, and simply asking that question, I think, is the most important first step. I'm not convinced that our current processes ensure that that all of our senior physicians are thinking about that. And I'm starting to get into that realm where I need to be a little bit more careful what I say, because I have some junior colleagues that are far brighter, far better, and better teachers in many ways. I think the second part is we need to not go from an abrupt 0 to 100 and then 100 to 0 in terms of our rate of practice. One of the things that I think is very interesting and very important for us in medicine, unlike all of the other professions, is that our senior leaders and our educators are still in active practice, and we accommodate that. If you go to a law school, if you go to a nursing school, if you go to an engineering school, none of the professors of engineering, nursing, or law will actually be in practice. And they will speak without an authentic accuracy about how things work. And so I think it's important for those of us who find ourselves in clinician scientist role not to divorce our clinical practice. It really informs our practice, our science. And for those of us who are in administrative roles, not to completely divorce that. It informs our administration, etc. And then the third role, I think, is the role of simulation and the role of coaching. Simulation for obvious reasons, the acquisition of new skills. Coaching, I think, can be very profound. Atul Gawande wrote a really important piece in the New Yorker that sparked this whole coaching model. Most interestingly, in Wisconsin, they have a surgical coaching model where cases, particularly bariatric cases, are filmed, and then a peer coach will review those cases and provide tips to improve performance. And much like Atul Gawande suggested, it was 3 hours doing a routine thyroidectomy with a surgical mentor that transformed his practice rather than hours of reading the journals and or going to conference. So I think there is a role for us to think about near peer coaches for clinicians who are increasing practice or who want to maintain practice after they've been divested to these other academic roles.
Yes, sounds very good. One final question from Nabela Mayotte. Looking back on your own journey of mastery and when you were a medical student, is there anything you would have changed when you think of the learning revision methods you used to use? If you had to choose a top tip for the medical students out there now, what would it be?
Oh, you're asking me like to choose which of my 3 children I love the most. That's a hard one. I think a really important piece is to understand that you need to be systematic. And maybe that's the thread that comes through all of the 5 key principles that I wanted to share. If you just jump in, the excitement and the enthusiasm of learning and of engaging in a lifelong passion is really generative. But at some point, the volume and the scope and the scale will catch up and the imposter syndrome will rise to the top. And I'm not sure if this is an antidote to the imposter syndrome, but I do think being systematic and planning it out in the same way that you might plan out other elements of your life. With a plan, you can see moments where you can find efficiencies and moments where there's redundancy. And being systematic and saying, I want to spend, before I dive into the deep end, a little bit of time mapping out the scale and the scope of what the pool looks like. So I know where the ladder is, I know where the lifeguard sits, and I know where the shallow end is in those eventualities that I need it so that I can achieve whatever I'm planning to learn here during this swimming lesson. The metaphor kind of breaks down a little bit. But in the absence of systematic processes, we end up with educational systems and educational practices that we've done all our life. Because as a medical student, you've already been through undergrad, perhaps through grad school, certainly you've been through primary and secondary school, and you will just continue on with the practices that you always did, highlighters and all. Well, probably guessing your generation, you have no idea what a highlighter is, but if you have that highlighting tab in your PDFs, that's just as bad. So systematic, laying out the landscape before you begin, I think would be the most helpful meta principle to adopt.
Sounds great. Thank you again to Dr. Sherbino for sharing your expertise. Do you have any final remarks?
I do. I want to have everyone work through a very brief exercise. This is the moment on your phone or on your computer. I want you to send yourself an email. And I want you to keep this email in your inbox and don't erase it or move it until Sunday morning. And I want you to answer this question that you see here on the screen. This is my weak attempt to undo the irony of a single intervention to change your knowledge and to change your exposure to education theory. So what is it? What do you want to research, and who do you need to talk to, and what do you want to start doing? As you think about it, I'll just tell you the funny story. For me, I'd given, not this talk, a variation on some education theory, and I realized at the end that I was a hypocrite. I wasn't doing some of the things I wanted to do. And so as a result of that initial talk I gave, I reached out to our senior residents and said, give me your electronic flashcard deck. And I uploaded and I started the practice of reviewing material that I knew cold 15, 20 years ago. And it was effortful, let me tell you. And I did not want to interleave it. But I know that it was a helpful reminder, because the things I thought I knew cold, my self-assessment was not on target. Next slide. And so these are the principles, they're not the processes. You need to figure out how to implement them. You need to figure out how to tailor them for your context. You know what you need, you know what your education program needs. These are not exhaustive, and the resources will provide further details. But if you can think of these 5 principles, I think you can take that magical 10,000 hours, that interminable period of residency and undergrad training, and perhaps find moments of efficiency, so that's not simply being stuck there until the bell rings, but where are the moments of effectiveness? And so here's what we need to recall. We construct knowledge. We don't simply upload it. The wicked problems of emergency medicine require specific, staged, progressive feedback. To sustain learning, you don't need a single vaccination, you need multiple re-inoculations. Effortful, mixed recall of knowledge is best. Elaboration is great. Simple forced staring at a resource is inefficient and ineffective. And finally, we learn by observation, by watching others, particularly others who influence us. Our students learn by watching what we do and trying those actions out. We learn by finding ourselves in groups with shared values. And so with that, many thanks to SAEM for this opportunity.
Wonderful. That was outstanding. Well, thanks. That concludes the keynote address for today. In a few moments, we will begin our next session. Thank you very much, Dr. Sherbino.